Two questions before I begin. Is anybody familiar with Stan Telchin? Second question. Does anybody remember the old Christian bookstore, Shekinah, that used to be down on Riverside Drive? Actually, it was in two different locations on Riverside Drive. Juanita and I used to make a pretty regular habit of stopping at Shekinah and looking around to see what kind of new things Greg, and his name was Greg too, by the way, Doug Lee, I'm sorry. We'd see what Doug had brought in. There was a spinner of cassette tapes in the back of the store, and I used to go through that constantly because they were getting new cassettes. Some of you younger folks probably don't even know what cassettes were, but they were, 30 years ago, they were top of the line. They were crackerjack technology, and you never knew what you were going to find on Doug's spinner. Sometimes it was music. You'd find quite a few different musical presentations, groups and individuals singing. As I turned the thing one day, I spotted a word on the back of one of those cassettes that totally grabbed my attention. Betrayed, with an exclamation point. And I picked that one up and looked at it, and it indicated that the individual who had made the cassette was going to share how he had been betrayed by his own child. And I was fascinated with it. I bought it, listened to it, and I have spoken about it. Actually bought the book. There is a book by Stan Telchin entitled Betrayed. I actually bought the book for my son-in-law. The story that Stan Telchin tells is one that I think you should be, I think you will be, interested in. Stan Telchin says that in 1974, he was celebrating his 50th birthday. And he said as he sat at the table while his wife Ethel and the girls Judy and Ann were cutting the cake and dishing out the ice cream, he said, I remember sitting there thinking that if I was not the luckiest man on earth, I had to be at least in the top 5. Had a fantastic home, beautiful home, had a 4-stall garage. Each member of the family had their own BMW, and each one had a stall in the garage for that. Had a very successful business, an Olympic-sized swimming pool and back, living the good life. And he said that day, when all of those good thoughts were passing through my mind, I had no idea that only in a few months I would be wishing I was dead. He says that his daughter, Judy, was a student at Boston University. His youngest daughter, Ann, was still in high school, an honors student in high school. And he said a couple of months after this birthday celebration, the phone rang one evening. And he said, I happened to be closest to it, and I picked it up and answered it. And it was Judy calling from Boston U. And he said that wasn't unusual. Judy usually called at least twice, maybe 3 times a week to catch up on what was going on at home, to see how the family was doing, and to share with, particularly with their mother Ethel and her sister Ann, the things that were going on in her life. And he said many times when she was through talking to both of them, she'd have a little time to talk to me. And he always, I said, enjoyed those. But he said, when I answered the phone and I realized who it was, I said, hang on, I'll get your mother, because she always talked to Ethel first. And he said, she said the most astounding thing. She said, Daddy, I need to talk to you. And he said a chill started at the top of my head and ran all the way down through my feet. I began to wonder what was going on with my precious daughter. And I said, sure. I said, sure, we'll talk. And she said, Daddy, I've written you a letter. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. It took me an entire week to compose this letter. And she said, when I finished, I realized that I couldn't just stick that in the mail and let you open it up without any warning. Would you let me read my letter to you now over the phone? And Stan said, go ahead. And she began to read. And she told him about new friends that she had made at Boston U. Very close personal friends they had become. Spent a lot of time together talking and studying different things. And the primary reason for her call in the letter itself was to tell him that she had reached the conclusion that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. And Stan said, when I heard that, I wished I could die. How could a good Jewish girl, brought up in a good Orthodox Jewish home, betray me, her mother and sister, her entire family, betray the heritage that was hers? And he said, I told her, you know, you'll be coming home in a few weeks anyway. Fall break was coming up. And he said, we'll talk about it then. And she said, okay, and hung up without talking to Mom or her sister, either one. Stan said he went to his wife Ethel and told her what Judy had just told him. And he said we stood and held each other and cried for hours. Fall break came. Judy came home. But there wasn't the same old closeness that had always been there. This time there was something cold, and they never got around to much conversation. Judy stayed mostly in her room the entire period of her fall break. And Stan didn't force any conversation until she was getting ready to leave. And as she was getting ready to leave, she told him, Dad, you're an intelligent man. You're an educated man. And he said, I want you to read the Bible. And he said, that was an extraordinary thought, an extraordinary thing to say to a Jew. That the rabbis didn't encourage us to read the Bible. What we got from them on Shabbat was good enough, you know, and all that we needed. And he said, I'd never read the Tanakh. I knew the prayers, you know, Dhammadah and all of the other prayers that are involved in Jewish worship. But he said after Judy left, he got to thinking about things, and he decided that he was going to study, he was going to read that thing, and he was going to get his daughter back. And pull her out of this new and horrible thing that she'd gotten herself involved in. For a little background on Stan, and he gives this background in his testimony. His folks came from Russia right after the turn of the 20th century. They came to escape the pogroms that were going on under the Tsar, and which would increase later under the Bolsheviks with the revolution. But they were already safely in the United States at that time. Stan said that he was 5 years old the first time he was ever called a Christ killer. He said, I didn't even know who they were talking about. All I knew was that I hadn't killed anybody. And he said, I ran home to my sweet mother, and she took me in her arms, dried my eyes and held me close and said, Stan, there's something you must remember. In this world, there is us, the Jews, the Jewish people, and there is them, the Goyim, the Gentiles, the Christians. And you have got to stay away from them, because sooner or later they are going to hurt you. About a year later, he said he was playing stickball with some of his friends on Sunday morning, and a lady started down the sidewalk where he was standing, was coming down the sidewalk dressed in her Sunday finest, carrying a large purse, and as she approached this little 6 or 7 year old boy, she reached out with her purse and knocked him off the sidewalk into the grass and said, "Stay out of my way, you nasty little Jew." And he said, I ran back home to my mother again, and he said, my mother again held me close and dried my eyes and said, Stan, you have got to remember, in this world, there's us, the Jews, and there is them, the Gentiles, and you have got to stay away from them, because sooner or later they are going to hurt you. As he grew, born he was in 1924, so you can imagine World War II began. He was old enough for service, was drafted into the Army, served his term in the Army, and then, of course, at the end of the war, news came out of the Holocaust. And Stan was reminded once again of his mother's words, you have got to stay away from them, because sooner or later they're going to hurt you. And now his daughter had become a part of this entity that had done so much damage to his ancestors, to the Jewish people through the ages. So betrayed, yes, he felt it, betrayed. But he took the challenge on. He went and bought a Bible because he didn't have one. He might have had 4 BMWs and an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but he'd never bothered to buy a Bible. They didn't figure they needed one. He went and bought a Bible. And he sat down one evening with the Bible, brought it with him into his study, brought in a thermos of coffee and a brand new pack of cigarettes, because he knew that he was going to need all of the strength he could find while he read this piece of hatred that was the Berit Hadashah, the New Testament. And he said, I opened this Bible to Matthew, and I began reading the Gospel of Matthew. And when I was finished, he said, I was the most confused human on the face of the earth. He said, I knew it had to be a book of hate, but there was no hatred there. Carol, he said, what I read was a letter written obviously by a Jew to his fellow Jews about a Jew that he had encountered and whom he believed to be the Mashiach, the Messiah. And he said, I continued to read. I read finally all the way through the New Testament, and he said, I was totally blown away. Why? He asked, do these people hate us so? There was no hate in this book. They talked about love, so they got a little weird at the end. Revelation. But he said there was no hatred here at all. And he said, I was so confused that I spoke to one of my customers one day who happened to be a Gentile and happened to be a Christian. He had an insurance agency, very successful. And this lady came in, and he explained to her what was going on in his family and in his life. And he said, I am so confused about what's happening? What's all of this about? And she said, Stan, I want to make a suggestion. He said, I want you to read 3 chapters of Scripture. And she said, they're not in this Berit Hadashah that you've been talking about. They're in your Tanakh. They're in your Old Covenant Scriptures. And she said, what I want you to read are Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and Jeremiah 31. I want you to read those and see what you think about those. Share a small portion of each of those with you. Psalm 22 has always amazed me that so many people are ignorant of what Psalm 22 is and what it says when the 23rd Psalm, the very next Psalm, is probably the best known Psalm of all. But very few people actually recognize the value of 22. 22 begins, my God, why have you abandoned me? Why have you forsaken me? Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. It did to him too. Why are you so far from helping me, so far from my anguish cries? By day I call to you, but you don't answer. Likewise at night, but I get no relief. Nevertheless, you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel, and you, our ancestors, put their trust. They trusted and you rescued them. They cried to you and escaped. They trusted in you and were not disappointed. But I'm a worm, not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me jeer at me. They sneer and shake their heads. He committed himself to Adonai, so let him rescue him. Let him set him free if he takes such delight in him. And Stan said, I saw him on the cross, and I didn't want to see that. He said, I closed the Bible, I closed the book, I walked away. And he said, the next evening I opened up to Isaiah 53, Yeshayahu 53. And I began to read. Beginning at verse 4, it was our diseases he bore, our pains for which he suffered. Yet we regarded him as punished, stricken, and afflicted by God. But he was wounded because of our crimes, crushed because of our sin. The disciplining that makes us whole fell on him, and by his bruises, by his stripes, we are healed. Stan said, I saw him on the cross again. But he said, this time I saw why he was on the cross. It was because of us, isn't it? Because of us. And so he turned over, he said, to Jeremiah 31. And if you'd like to follow along, I'm going to read a few verses from Jeremiah 31, verse 31 through verse 34. Here the days are coming, says Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Yehudah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day I took them by their hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, because they, for their part, violated my covenant, even though I, for my part, was a husband to them, says Adonai. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Adonai. I will put my Torah within them, and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will any of them teach his fellow community member or his brother, know Adonai, for all will know me, from the least of them to the greatest, because I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. Stan said the rabbis never told us anything about any new covenant. They had never mentioned anything about a new covenant. But he said, I continued to be confused, and I was looking through my newspaper one evening and happened to turn to the back and just happened to see this blurb that was in the back that stated that there was going to be a convocation of Messianic Jews in a little town in Pennsylvania real close to Philadelphia, small town. And he said, as I read that, I wondered just how many Messianic Jews would show up in that little town. And I decided I would go. And he said, I went. And believe it or not, several hundred Messianic Jews showed up in that little town. And he said, I was enjoying the fellowship, met some wonderful people, trying to make sense out of what they were saying, what they were doing. And he said there was a lady named Lydia who became a close friend of his in just those few days. A very dear woman, he said, a very special lady. And he said one day we were walking between sessions, and as we were walking down the street, she asked a question. She said, Stan, how long have you been a believer? And he said, I was absolutely stopped in my tracks. And he said, no, you've got to understand, I'm not a believer, I'm a searcher. I'm just a seeker. And he, coming up, he sat on a bench, and she said, Stan, let's sit here for just a few minutes. And he said, I sat down, and she sat down, and she handed me her Bible. And she said, Stan, I want you to read just a few lines to me from that Bible. I want you to turn to the 20th chapter of Exodus and begin reading with the first verse. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other God before me. And she said, Stan, that's enough. Go ahead and close the Bible. And said, she looked straight into my eyes and said, Stan, I want you to tell me who or what is your God. And he said, I got mad. I said, listen, you're not talking to some pagan, some heathen. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I grew up as an Orthodox Jew. I know who God is. And she said, no, I don't want to hear your theology or your philosophy. He said, what I want to hear is what or who is on your mind when you wake up in the morning? What or who is on your mind when you lie down at night? And what or who is in your mind throughout the day? I want to know who or what is your God. And he said at that point we had to stop because the next session was coming up. And he said we went on. And he said the evening came and I went to bed, and to tell the truth, I didn't sleep much that night. The words of the day kept rolling over and over in my mind. I got up the next morning, not really on top of things because I hadn't had much rest. Walked down to the cafeteria there at the hotel, to have breakfast, and he said, as I walked into the dining room, the group that I had spent so much time with were all sitting at one table, and I joined them. He said, and we all ordered our breakfast. He said, when the food came out, Lillian, who was part of the group, stood up and said, I'm going to ask Stan to say the blessing for us this morning. And he said, I thought to myself, what? He said, I didn't know any blessings. He said, I knew the Hebrew prayer for bread. That was all I really knew. He said, I said that. And he said, these people love to talk to each other and to God about their food and each other. And he said, I thanked him for the food that was before us. And I thanked him for these wonderful friends that I had made, these beautiful people that I had met. And then he said, I said the most extraordinary thing without a thought. He said, I said, in Jesus' name. And he said, a rocket took off somewhere inside my being. And he said, when we finished breakfast, I had to rush to a telephone. I had to call Ethel. Ethel knew what he was doing. Said, in fact, Ethel and Ann were doing their own search of the scriptures. And he said, when Ethel answered the phone, I told her what had just happened. And he said, she said to me, thank God we're all together. She and Ann had both already come to that realization that Yeshua is the Mashiach, that he is the Messiah. Stan would go on to lose his business. If you are a Jewish individual, particularly in the Northeast where he lived, if you are a Jewish individual who becomes a Christian, then most of your customers actually would probably be and were for him Jews themselves. And when they found out that he had accepted Christ, guess what? They took their business elsewhere. Stan ended up becoming a minister of the gospel and had his own television program for a number of years, preached in crusades in different places around the country. One story that I read about him that was not part of his testimony, and would not have been, had to do with his brother. He had a brother named Joe. And Joe had literally cut off all communication with Stan. Stan had the rest of his family when he became a Christian, but he had prayed for his family. And he said one day he got a call. Joe was in the hospital and he was in bad shape, and he wanted Stan to come to see him, and Stan went. And he wanted to know about this Yeshua that Stan kept talking about, and Stan explained to him who Yeshua was, explained to him the conversation, or the conversations that he had had and the experience that he had had. And he led his brother in that hospital bed to Christ. Joe died 48 hours later. He came within 48 hours of missing a special blessing. Stan finally would end his career as a member of the staff of Jews for Jesus. If any of you are familiar with them, I became acquainted with them a number of years ago, and they very much affected my life. They don't claim so much to be messianic, but they are definitely Christian, and they, by virtue of what they are and what they do, they've got to be, don't they claim? They are Messianic Jews, whether they claim to be or not, and they do a lot of good work. In this world, There is us, and there is them. And Stan, you have to stay away from them, because sooner or later they are going to hurt you. Have you ever wondered why it's so difficult to bring the message of the gospel to Jewish people? And understand this, they are coming to the gospel. And they are coming to the gospel in considerable numbers. There have been more Jewish people come to Christ in the past century, in the past 100 years, than did in the entire 19 centuries between Christ and that time. They are coming. And the crowd continues to grow that will cry out, Baruch haba b'Shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They're being prepared. They're being made ready. Circumstances in Israel at this moment are not what we wish they might be. They're having their difficulties, as are the other nations of the earth, and there's a great deal of turmoil and chaos touching this earth. I feel kind of like Rabbi Sachs. Jonathan, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Any of you ever watched his videos? He's constantly going up to make sure his kippah is not falling off his head. And mine was beginning to slide there. But the one thing that is absolutely certain is that God has his plan. Nothing and no one is going to interfere with his plan. It's going to be completed. If you read the prophets and you look at world events, I promise you, you will see things that will make the goose flesh that I have right now stand on your arms and back. By no means has Adonai departed from his people, nor has he set his people aside. There is a passage, and it just crossed my mind, and I can't remember where it is. Quentin may remember the passage, but there is a passage in which he says, this is a message to the world. If you think that Israel is no longer a nation in my sight, he says, look up. Are the sun and the moon and the stars still in their places? He said, look out. Is the sea still rushing to the shore? He said, as long as these things stand, Israel is a nation before me. The church has certainly not always been kind to the Jewish people. I was reading an article this week about Sir Godfrey Bouillon. Everybody knows who he is, right? He was a lay leader in the Knights Templar. And in 1099, when the First Crusade captured Jerusalem, Godfrey, my 29th great uncle, became the precept. He refused to accept the term of king because it was Jerusalem, and he said Jerusalem only has one king. But he became the precept of Jerusalem. He would keep it for a year, and he would die of leprosy, and his brother would take, my other 29th uncle, would take the throne instead. When they captured Jerusalem, there was a mass slaughter of the Muslims and Jews that were then. Most of the Christians had been booted out by the Muslims before the Crusader army got there, because they were afraid that the Jews would rebel inside the city and help those who were attacking, or the Christians would help those who were attacking from the outside. But they slaughtered men, women, and children. They said blood ran to the knees in some places. Muslim and Jew alike. Stan's mother, God bless her, had reason to give Stan that advice of hers. She was talking about the experience of history. We have an obligation, and it's a very serious obligation, to carry the message of Yeshua, the message of redemption, the message of salvation to his brethren. And it's very important that we do that. Now, we have some folks among us. My brother Quentin is Jewish. God love him. I am Gentile. Supposedly, Abraham is my 122nd great-grandfather. Now, you can realize that I do a lot of playing around with genealogy, right? And there's no way anybody could ever positively prove that, but it's an interesting thought, despite the fact that according to this genealogical firm, I'm related to him not through Isaac, not through Isaac, but through Ishmael, the founder, or would become the founder of the Arab nations, and an ancestor of Muhammad. There is a need for us to help the Jews understand that we love them and we need to love and support the Jewish people individually, as well as the nation of Israel. I spoke the other week about how many increases there are in different nations of this world in anti-Semitism. It's staggering. It's staggering. Melanie Phillips says that they've increased in Britain by over 500% in the past year. That's sad. That's very sad. And we need to be part of the answer to that. We need to stand with them. We need to stand for them. We need to stand together. And above all things, we need to stand for him. He is our being. He is our